today, the more the world changes, the more Malcolm X stays the same.
When we think of who we can be and what we need to be in this moment to liberate ourselves, we can look to Malcolm X.
We talked to author Ibram X. Kendi about what Malcolm's legacy means now in a moment of backlash, book bans, and political reckoning. I'm Natasha Del Toro, and this is The Take.
My name is Ibram X. Kendi. I'm an historian. I primarily study the history of racism and even how people can be anti-racist. And I'm based in Boston in the United States.
Well, it is such a pleasure to have you on The Take with us today and talking about your exciting new projects. Thank you for joining us. So you have a new book called Malcolm Lives, the official biography of Malcolm X for young readers. And I'm curious, I think we should start off this conversation by saying, who was Malcolm X to you?
So to me, Malcolm X was one of the most inspirational and fearless revolutionaries, African-American revolutionaries and orators, of the 20th century. Someone who encouraged Black people to love themselves, someone who argued worldwide that Islam was a religion of love and human rights, someone who had the capacity to get at the root of our political problems and the bravery to talk truthfully, about those problems and encourage people to transform them.
And Malcolm X has, he has been written about extensively. I remember as a young person when I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, it was a hugely eye-opening experience for me. But there's been a lot of work written about him. There's even a children's book that was written by his daughter, Ilyasa Shabazz, who I understand you work closely with her and the Malcolm X estate on your book. What did you feel that you could bring to this story?
Well, first and foremost, I think Malcolm Lives is largely set in scenes from Malcolm X's life. And so it allows young readers and even older readers to really get a 360 view of what Malcolm was facing, thinking, saying, transforming in particular key moments in his life. But then those moments, those places, those words, those ideas are routinely connected to the here and the now, so people could see how Malcolm's message lives, how his legacy, is relevant. And then the other aspect of the book is that I really spent quite a bit of time documenting Malcolm's life as a young person. And this was a young person who lost his father, who lost his mother, who had to move multiple times, who was picked on at school, who had to be in detention homes, who faced poverty, who faced hunger, whose dreams were shot down, and who was incarcerated. So many of the things youth are navigating, the adversities that they're navigating, Malcolm navigated as a young person.
I love how you brought in some artifacts from his life as a young person that had never been seen before. You've got notes. There was a note to his sister Henrietta. You have photos. You have other elements that the public has not seen. And I like what you just said too, of really showing him as a young person and the struggles that he faced, and showing him kind of as a normal person who goes through hard things, right? And how he kind of navigates those struggles and becomes this great leader, thinker. Now, so this book has come out just in time to commemorate what would have been Malcolm X's 100th birthday on May 19th. And it's been 60 years since he was assassinated. And this country has changed a lot since then. Or I know you've made the point that maybe it hasn't. Maybe it's come all the way back around again. So as you were writing this book, what parallels did you see between the world that Malcolm X lived in and the present day?
I think there are a number of really painful parallels. I think one just parallel off the bat that's specific to Malcolm X is that when people like Malcolm X expressed the equality of the racial groups or challenged directly racism, particularly after coming back from Mecca, he wasn't described as a person who was trying to ensure that Black people had power over Black communities. He was described as a Black supremacist. He was described as anti-white.
But when a Black man strikes back, he's an extremist. He's supposed to sit passively and have no feelings, be nonviolent, and love his enemy. No matter what kind of attack, be it verbal or otherwise, he's supposed to take it. But if he stands up and in any way tries to defend himself, then he's an extremist.
We're living in a time in which currently, when people are saying the lives of Black people matter, or they're fighting against racism, it's they're being recast as somebody who somehow is anti-white, as if there's not a scenario in which we could all live collectively with human rights and mutual respect.
Mm-hmm. So you are seeing these parallels, and in this current climate that we're in, Trump's second presidency, we are seeing attacks from the administration and its allies on, racial inequity initiatives. I'm thinking, diversity, equity, and inclusion, known as DEI.
As of 5 this afternoon, every federal DEI office in the country got shuttered. DEI employees woke up this morning and found out their emails are suspended and they've been put on leave.
Sir, this is about reforming the system of hiring in the federal government to ensure that merit is the lodestar of hiring decisions
as per the Supreme Court.
Other matters. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, this is a big deal. Merit. Our country is going to be based on merit again.
We are leaving wokeness and weakness behind. No more pronouns, no more climate change obsession, no more emergency vaccine mandates, no more dudes in dresses. We're done with that.
We've also seen book bans, something that you've been a target of in the past. And I'm from Florida, so I've had a front row seat to seeing how the GOP has been policing how Black history is taught in schools. On top of that, you have immigration and campus crackdowns. What's your take on the climate that we're seeing right now?
Well, it's interesting. I remember Malcolm X gave a speech in Los Angeles in 1962 before a crowd of Black people. And he said to those Black people,
"Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other." No, before you come asking Mr. Muhammad, does he teach hate? You should ask yourself, who taught you to hate being what God gave you?
And so when you're a Black child and you're a Black adult and you're not able to learn about Black history, or even if you're a non-Black child and you're not able to learn about Black history, it's ultimately going to cause you to either hate yourself or hate those Black people. And so we're seeing the same thing today, the negative effects of historical ignorance.
Mm-hmm. And so many of these things end up becoming, internalized. So I guess what is interesting to me, though, is just how quickly things have changed just in recent years. 5 years ago, it was the summer of George Floyd protests. We saw people marching in the streets, and it was a moment that people were really willing to, it seemed to me, like look at systemic racism in the face and try to dismantle these systems. And that was a time that was being called as a racial reckoning in this country. I mean, now, fast forward to what we're seeing with these attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, can you believe how quickly things have changed?
In certain ways, I can't. But then when I look at the current moment through the lens of history, unfortunately, this has happened multiple times over the course of American history, in which there were efforts at abolition or efforts at civil rights or efforts at suffrage or women's rights or efforts at anti-racist sort of gains, and those who wanted to conserve racism or sexism or another form of bigotry typically responded with vehemence and typically framed those efforts as somehow harmful to convince a segment of Americans to resist them as if they were protecting themselves, when in reality, they ended up supporting a movement, a political movement that undermined them too. And so we're seeing this now, in which you have Trump voters who are regretting for voting for Trump because their loved ones are being deported, or they're losing their rights, or they're losing their jobs, or they're losing, their livelihoods. This has happened time and again in American history.
More with Ibram after the break. So, Ibram, we've seen the pendulum swing back this other way in just these few years. And I know that things have also changed pretty drastically for you as well in your personal and professional life. In 2020, I remember seeing your name and your book was everywhere. You were a go-to voice for conversations about racial inequity and justice, and your book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, had made it to #1 in the New York Times bestseller list. You were a MacArthur Fellow. You had just launched the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research, which had a big vision, had raised $55 million, had a big staff. But you also faced some criticism for your leadership there, and the center is now closing. Ibram, I'm curious, what a wild ride. What has this all been like for you?
Well, it's interesting to have navigated that ride while I was writing this biography of Malcolm X, because Malcolm X ended up being killed by members of the Nation of Islam, by other ministers who were deeply critical of his leadership.
Malcolm's home in New York was firebombed, and just 1 week later, 39-year-old Malcolm X was gunned down by members of the Nation of Islam. But there are those who still believe the government had a hand in Malcolm's death.
There were many people during his era who had all sorts of issues with the way he thought and the way he acted in the world, even Black people. And that's not including the level of attacks that he faced from people who wanted to conserve racism or convince Black people to continue to hate themselves. And so I tried to, in many ways, as I was facing this personal backlash, to not take it personal, because I've noticed how so many figures across history, have faced sort of similar challenges, and I think in many ways that probably made the book better because I could have some sense of what Malcolm, particularly the last few years, of his life, was facing. And I think, ironically, Malcolm ended up deciding to leave the Nation of Islam and ended up deciding to create his own organizations. And ultimately, I decided to go to Howard University. And I think there's also parallels there.
Yeah, for sure. I also know that you had battled stage 4 colon cancer, which is, the challenges that you faced. Also, these attacks from the right-wing media must have been very intense as well.
A subliterate pamphlet on how the United States is a disgusting, immoral country that must be changed immediately and forever. That tract is entitled How to Be an Anti-Racist. It is written by a former University of Florida professor called Henry Rogers, who, now that he is rich and famous, goes by his revolutionary name, Ibram X. Kendi. The book is garbage.
So then to receive criticisms from your own staff, I guess as I've been reading your book, I think it's as much about Malcolm X's life and legacy as it is a self-reflection of your own journey. When you think about the criticism that you faced, what are the lessons that you draw from Malcolm X?
So many lessons. I think one lesson is that I think the unfortunate truth is that Malcolm would talk a lot, particularly the last few years of his life, about how much books transformed him. And he was a voracious reader. And he would have been one of those students if he went to college that he wasn't going to say anything unless he read a book. And unfortunately, we have many people who have serious issues with my books and they've never read my books. And I have to just accept that reality, right? I also have to accept the reality, and this is something that Malcolm faced within the Nation of Islam, that other ministers had serious issues with him precisely because he was so popular. Indeed, the head of the Newark Mosque of the Nation of Islam, which oversaw his assassination, that's precisely why that minister despised him and hated him. And so, unfortunately, that's just something you have to accept. And Malcolm accepted it, and other leaders over the course of history have accepted it as well. And I've learned to accept that too.
Mm-hmm. I do wonder, and I know that Malcolm X, one of the things that was so great about him was his ability for self-reflection and self-critique. And I imagine that was an inspiration for you. Are there things that you would have done differently?
So I think the biggest thing actually that we decided to do differently was to focus really, and this is actually one thing I'm excited about to do at Howard University is really, instead of uh, hiring a number of staff who would do projects that we are suggesting and trying to develop, instead we're building a fellowship program whereby we will support fellows who are going to come in and really do their own work and do their own projects. And that was one of the major things we realized would just be much more impactful and effective. Secondly, I wrote a follow-up paperback edition to How to Be an Anti-Racist. And in this paperback edition, I actually chronicle my own development and journey. So to give an example, one of the things that I actually learned and changed in the book was my language around ability and disability. And so there was a lot of ableist terms that I removed. There's been a lot of work in recent years on the criminal legal system and us sort of rethinking how we frame people. So there was a lot of terms and concepts in that book, like even the term criminal, can be problematic if used in particular ways, that I also updated. And so, I'm trying to continue to model that. And I certainly try to do that in How to Be an Anti-Racist.
I want to switch gears a little bit because, Al Jazeera has a global audience, and Malcolm X connected the Black struggle in the U.S. to anti-imperialist movements worldwide. So as we continue to witness Israel's brutal war on the people of Gaza, which is, I understand, a place that Malcolm X visited, how can anti-racist movements today build solidarity across borders?
Well, I think first and foremost, I'm happy you mentioned that Malcolm visited Gaza in 1964. It was really just a day and a half, but he was truly moved and inspired, by that visit. Ended up coming back to Egypt and writing a piece that challenged Israeli Zionism in particular. I think one thing that anti-racists across borders can use as a place for solidarity is typically imperialism is justified by dehumanizing the particular groups that's being subjected to apartheid or settler colonialism or genocide. And that is whether those people are Arab or Black, or Asian. And I think we can recognize those similar forms of language. For instance, you've had Palestinians who've been literally called human animals. Black people have been described as human animals. There's all sorts of ways in which people have been framed as not human to then justify the carnage and the plunder of those people. And I think we need to connect that across borders and across races to really build a multiracial, anti-racist global movement that challenges imperialism wherever it is.
Mm-hmm. Ibram, I want to talk about the future a little bit and bring it back to your book. You know, I know that you wrote this book for young people. So for young people who are reading it and diving into who Malcolm X was for the first time and discovering him, if he were alive today, what do you think his message might be to them?
I think his message would be to be fearless, especially in this moment where we have state power who is trying, whether that's in the United States or even in the Middle East or, Western and Eastern Europe, parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, who are literally trying to induce fear through soldiers, through prisons, through propaganda. And that then fear can bind us and control us. And Malcolm somehow, some way was able to be fearless. He knew that the US government, he knew that the Nation of Islam wanted him silenced, wanted him stopped, but he didn't stop. And he realized that if you are not liberated, then in many ways, you're not alive. These are things that he talked about literally to really inspire himself and to inspire others. And fortunately, we see young people all over the world who are literally fearless. And I think that Malcolm X is not only one of the more pivotal historical figures of the 20th century, but I think human beings have so much to learn from his life. And, from ultimately, he died with a message of human rights, a message of encouraging people across the world to fight for the rights that they should be receiving as human beings. He was very vigilant about saying, no, these are not things we should be requesting. These are not things we should be demanding. These are things that should be guaranteed to us as human beings. And of course, he was saying this primarily to Black people, and to Muslims, but it was a message really for all people, particularly in this moment where our human rights, are being snatched left and right. And so when we think of who we can be and what we need to be in this moment to liberate ourselves, we can look to Malcolm X.
Thank you for coming on The Take and sharing your story and this book with the world.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And that's The Take. Now, we want to hear from you. What stories do you want to see next on the show? Let us know in the comments below what you'd like us to cover, because your feedback helps shape future episodes. See you tomorrow.